The alarm on Claire Harmon's phone went off at 6:30, but she had been awake since 5. She lay in the narrow guest bed of her grandfather's house in Alexandria, Virginia, staring at the ceiling the way she always did before a story she could not yet name. The October light was just beginning to press itself against the curtains, pale and uncertain, the kind of light that does not commit to anything. She could hear him already moving in the kitchen below, the slow, deliberate footsteps, the quiet knock of a cast-iron skillet finding the burner, the smell of coffee, dark and strong, curling up through the old house like something that had always lived there. Walter Harmon had been awake for hours. Claire knew this without having to ask. She reached for her notebook on the nightstand, a journalist's reflex. She had filled half of it already background on the Marine Corps birthday ball at the Grand Meridian Hotel in downtown Washington, guest lists pieced together from public records, names of decorated veterans who would be attending as honored guests. General Desmond Aldridge, retired 2 stars, 35 years of service, Medal of Honor recipients, congressional aides, defense contractors in black tie. And then near the bottom of the list, added almost as an afterthought by the general's own office, Walter Harmon, personal guest of General Aldridge. No rank, no unit, no citation, just the name and those 2 words, personal guest, as if they were explanation enough. Claire had circled them 3 times. She pulled on her clothes and went downstairs. He was standing at the stove with his back to her, wearing the same gray thermal undershirt he wore every morning, his white hair still uncombed. 2 eggs sunny side up already in the skillet. A plate set for her at the table. A glass of orange juice she had not asked for. A folded paper napkin placed with the kind of quiet precision that says more about a man's character than most people manage to say in an entire conversation. She sat down and watched him cook. Walter Harmon was 86 years old, and he moved the way very old buildings hold themselves together, not without effort, but with a structural integrity that suggested collapse was simply not a concept he had ever agreed to. His hands were large and scarred across the knuckles in ways that had long since faded to white. His face was a topographical map of weather and time, deep-lined and around the eyes and mouth, the face of a man who had spent decades outdoors in conditions that did not care about comfort. He was not tall, not anymore, the years having taken an inch or 2 that he never talked about losing. But he occupied space differently than most men his age. He occupied it completely. He set her plate down without ceremony and sat across the table with his coffee. They ate in the particular silence that belongs only to people who have known each other long enough that silence requires no apology. Claire was 24 years old and the youngest staff writer at a mid-sized digital publication that covered veterans affairs and defense policy. She had grown up visiting this house on holidays, sleeping in that same narrow guest bed, listening to the sound of his footsteps before dawn. Her parents had divorced when she was 9, and Walt had become quietly and without announcement the most stable presence in her life. She had never questioned what that stability was built on. It had simply always been there, like the house, like the coffee. It was only in the last year, since she had started covering veteran stories professionally, that she had begun to notice the gaps. No photographs on the walls, no plaques, no frame commendations, no VFW membership, no unit reunions, no newsletters in a drawer. Every other veteran she had interviewed had left visible marks of their service on their lives, even the most private ones. Walt had left nothing visible. Whatever he had kept somewhere she had never been invited to look. She thought about this while washing the dishes after breakfast. She thought about those 2 circled words, personal guest. She heard him go upstairs to dress. 20 minutes later, she went up to let him know the car was ready, and she found him standing before the open closet holding the jacket. It was a leather bomber jacket made sometime in the early 1970s, cut close and practical, the leather worn to an almost buttery softness through decades of use. The color had deepened from whatever original brown it had started as into something richer and darker. Old saddle leather left in the sun for years at a time. It had been restitched at the cuffs more than once. He wore it the way some men wear a second skin. On the left sleeve, just below the shoulder, was a patch, small, no bigger than a silver dollar, and so old that the embroidery had compressed and faded until the image was barely legible. Claire had noticed it before, in the way you notice a feature of a face you have seen 10,000 times without ever studying it. But standing in the doorway of his bedroom on this particular morning, she looked at it closely. A snake, coiled tight head, raised fangs extended, wrapped around a jagged bolt of lightning. The thread had gone the color of old copper, and the background fabric had faded to a kind of dusty gray. But the image itself, even diminished by time, carried something. A tension. A compressed kinetic energy like a wound spring. She was about to ask about it when Walt stepped past her to the nightstand and opened the top drawer. In doing so, his elbow caught the edge of a small object on the back corner of the closet shelf, and it fell. It landed on the hardwood floor with a clean metallic sound. Claire picked it up before he could. It was a small box roughly the size of a deck of cards made of brushed aluminum that had gone dark with age. No visible hinges, no obvious latch, whatever mechanism held it closed was internal. The surface was smooth except for two letters engraved near the center of the lid pressed deep into the metal in a plain serif font that looked hand-done rather than machine-stamped. Walt took it from her hand in one smooth, unhurried motion. His expression did not change. He placed it back in the drawer and closed it with a quiet click and stood for a moment with his hand resting flat on the nightstand surface, his back half turned to her. He said nothing. Claire understood that she was not going to ask. Not yet. But she had already memorized the shape of the box, the weight of it in her palm, the way those two letters sat in the metal like initials carved into stone. She pulled out her phone and took a photograph of the patch on his sleeve before she could think too hard about it. Walt put on his watch. He looked at her with the calm, unhurried patience of a man who has waited out considerably worse things than a curious granddaughter. "Ready," he said. "Ready," she said. They went downstairs. The drive from Alexandria to the Grand Meridian took 45 minutes in morning traffic. Claire drove. Walt sat with his hands folded in his lap, watching the city through the passenger window, with the expression of a man watching weather, noting it, unmoved by it. At the first red light, she opened her browser and ran a reverse image search on the photograph. The results were useless. Generic merchandise novelty patches, no coherent connection to any verifiable military unit. She tried a description, military patch coiled snake around lightning bolt Cold War era. Still nothing exact. She tried Walter Harmon veteran. Nothing. Not a citation, not a community mention, not a surviving relative line in any public record. For a man in his mid-80s in the digital age, that level of absence was nearly impossible unless it was deliberate. She put the phone down on her thigh and drove for a while without searching. "Grandpa," she said. That patch on your jacket, you said a friend gave it to you." A pause. Not uncomfortable. The pause of a man who chooses his words the way a craftsman chooses tools for fitness, not speed. "That's right," he said. "What does it mean, the snake and the lightning bolt?" He was quiet for a moment that stretched a little longer than the previous one. "It means we were fast," he said, "and not particularly forgiving." He said it the way you state a fact about terrain. No added weight, no drama in the telling, just a description laid flat, complete in itself. Claire didn't press. She picked up her notebook at the next red light and wrote the words from memory, her handwriting small and tight in the margin. She underlined them once, then she kept driving. But the image stayed with her. The handmade quality of the stitching, the care in those faded threads. She had worked the veterans beat long enough to know that unit patches were not casual things. They were chosen with the deliberateness of men who understood that the symbol they wore into the field was sometimes the last thing by which they would be identified. The choice was never arbitrary. She turned the two letters over in her mind. IV, the box too heavy to be empty, too deliberately hidden to be meaningless. She had the particular journalist instinct that tells you when you have touched the edge of something real, not the comfortable real of a story that fits the space you prepared for it, but the other kind, the kind that is larger than any container you thought to bring. She glanced at him. He was still watching the city, his expression undisturbed. "She thought he has worn that jacket every cold day of my life that I can remember seeing him. And I have never once asked where it came from." She did not ask now. She turned onto K Street and let the question ride in silence beside them. The Grand Meridian Hotel occupied a full city block, 19 stories of granite and glass built in the 1950s and renovated since into something colder and more expensive. The lobby was designed to make you aware of its dimensions: marble floors, the color of cream, high ceilings carrying chandeliers that dropped long trails of crystal, dark wood paneling that suggested permanence and discretion in equal measure. By mid-morning, the setup for the evening's ball was underway. Staff moved quickly. Florists arranged centerpieces the size of small trees in the ballroom off the main corridor. A sound technician ran cables along the carpet edge with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times. The check-in table for ball attendees sat near the main entrance, a long table staffed by two Marine NCOs in dress blues, their posture the kind that makes civilians stand fractionally straighter without knowing why. Captain Derek Calloway stood to the left of the entrance with a clipboard. He was 32 years old and looked exactly as he intended. His dress blues were impeccable in the way that requires not just care, but a specific relationship with perfection, the creases sharp enough to cut the brass buttons, polished beyond shine, into something almost aggressive. His ribbons were arranged with mathematical precision. He was lean and angular, with the kind of square jaw and flat, appraising gaze that photographs well at ceremonies and communicates nothing particularly warm in person. His hair was cut with the geometry of someone who understood that appearance was itself a form of argument. He had graduated near the top of his class at Annapolis. His evaluations used words like discipline, decisive, high potential. He had served 8 years without once being in a position where someone was actively trying to kill him, a fact his record never mentioned, and which he had never once examined. He stood at the entrance reviewing the attendee manifest with the small, satisfied energy of a man demonstrating to no audience in particular that he took this responsibility seriously. Gideon Kowalski watched him from across the lobby. Kowalski was 58 years old and built along the lines of a man who had spent the first half of his life doing things that were hard on the body and the second half carrying the memory of them with quiet competence. He had retired from the Marine Corps as a master sergeant after 26 years, 2 combat deployments, and a training record that Paris Island instructors still referenced in certain informal contexts. He now ran hotel security at the Grand Meridian, a job he had taken partly for the income and partly because the Marines who passed through this place twice a year reminded him of who he had been, and that felt worth staying near. He had been watching Calloway for 40 minutes with the unhurried attention of a man who has learned to read rooms for a living, and in those 40 minutes he had made a complete assessment. He knew the type that wore the uniform as an identity rather than a responsibility. The type whose authority was loudest in rooms where no one was positioned to question it. He was still watching when the main doors opened and Walter Harmon walked in. Walt walked into the Grand Meridian the way a man walks into a condition he has been in before. Not this hotel specifically, but this particular experience of being assessed and found wanting before a single word has been spoken. He walked through it without adjusting his pace or his expression. His eyes moved across the lobby with a calm taking everything in quality that reacted to none of what it found. The leather jacket sat on his shoulders like something that belonged there permanently. Claire walked beside him, half a step behind, and to the left her bag over one shoulder and her notebook already in hand. She had been in enough rooms like this for work to know how to carry herself. She had not been in enough of them to be fully comfortable. They approached the check-in table. The NCO behind it looked up, found Claire's face, and offered the practiced smile of someone whose job requires it. He looked past her to Walt, and the smile held genuinely in the way young military personnel sometimes look at very old men and feel without being able to explain it that a specific form of respect is appropriate. They were not stopped by the NCO. The voice came from the left, precise and calibrated, carrying authority through tone rather than volume. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" Claire turned. Calloway stood 3 feet away, clipboard at his side, his gaze moving between her and Walt with the polite, assessing patience of a man who has already formed his conclusion and is now constructing the question to justify it. She felt Walt stop beside her. She felt rather than heard the quality of his stillness. "No problem," she said. "We're checking in. My grandfather is an invited guest tonight." Calloway's gaze traveled to Walt. It moved down the length of the leather jacket and came back to the face and settled there with a careful neutrality that was its own kind of judgment. "And the invitation," he said. "Right here." She opened her bag and produced the envelope. Heavy paper, the Marine Corps emblem embossed on the front, the general's seal on the back. She held it out. Calloway took it with 2 fingers and opened it with the deliberate care of a man handling evidence. He read it, or appeared to, then he folded it closed and held it a moment. "Walter Harmon," he said, tasting the name. "I don't see this on the manifest. He's a personal guest of General Aldrich. I understand that's what the invitation states." He said it pleasantly. "But this event is for verified active duty personnel, registered veterans with documented credentials, and their approved guests. We have a process for a reason." Walt had still not spoken. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, his weight evenly distributed, his eyes on Calloway. His expression was entirely undisturbed. It was this, Claire would understand much later, that Calloway could not tolerate not the inconvenience of the old man's presence, but the absolute refusal to register his authority as a force that required response. He needed the acknowledgement of the dynamic. Walt was not providing it. "Sir," Calloway said with the measured patience of a man explaining a simple concept to someone he had already decided could not be expected to understand it, "I'm going to need some form of identification. A veteran's card, a D-214, something verifiable." "He has the invitation," Claire said. "An invitation is not credentials, miss. He was personally invited by the base commander. General Aldridge is upstairs preparing for this evening, which means he is not available to verify that in this moment." A short pause timed well. "We can't allow anyone to walk in off the street claiming to be a guest of a 2-star general." The phrase claiming to be landed with a particular weight. Around them, the lobby had gone subtly quieter. The florist had stopped moving. A group of officers near the far wall had turned, not obviously, but enough. The two NCOs at the check-in table were studying their clipboards with a focused intensity that meant they were very deliberately not watching what was happening. Kowalski took half a step forward from his position near the wall. Calloway's head turned. The look he sent across the room was immediate and precise, carrying the full weight of rank used as a blunt instrument. "I have this under control, Sergeant." He used the old title deliberately. Not Mr., not by his name. Sergeant. A reminder that the hierarchy followed a man even into civilian life. Kowalski stopped. His jaw tightened. He retreated 2 steps. But his eyes never left Walt's face. And in those eyes was the specific look of a man who has recognized something and is calculating rapidly what to do about it. Calloway turned back to the old man. He was emboldened now by the audience, by the display of control, by the quiet pleasure of a man whose authority has been visibly exercised in a room full of witnesses. He stepped closer. Not enough to be physically threatening in any technical definition, but enough to claim the space between them as his own. His eyes dropped to the patch on Walt's sleeve. Here, for just a fraction of a second, something changed. It was small. The kind of thing that only Kowalski, watching from the edge of the room with the trained attention of 2 decades of reading people in difficult situations, actually caught. A slight involuntary pause. A fractional narrowing of the eyes. The expression of a man who has seen something that does not fit the story he has already written and is deciding rapidly whether to revise the story or dismiss the evidence. 2 years ago, in the final semester of a leadership studies program, Derek Calloway had produced a 30-page analysis of classified Cold War special operations units, drawing on partially declassified documents in military archives. The paper had earned him high marks and a note from his professor about the quality of his research. On page 14, it contained a hand-drawn reproduction of an insignia he had found in a half-redacted intelligence brief, a coiled serpent wrapped around a bolt of lightning, identified only by the notation, Project Viper Unit Designation Unknown. Operational status terminated. He had concluded on the evidence available to him that all 5 members of the unit had been killed in the operation of November 1972. He had written it confidently. His professor had written excellent in the margin. He looked at the patch on the old man's sleeve for 1 full second. Then he made his decision. The patch was old and faded, the kind of thing available at any surplus store or military memorabilia show. The old man was exactly what he appeared to be, an elderly civilian, in a worn jacket probably brought along by a well-meaning granddaughter who had found an invitation somewhere. He had seen this kind of thing before. It was not malicious. It was simply a problem to be managed. He lifted his eyes from the patch to Walt's face with the expression of a man who has considered and dismissed. "Every genuine service member has a record," he said. "Every veteran I have spoken to tonight has been able to produce some form of documentation. A uniform, an identification." He gestured at the jacket, a small, dismissive arc of his wrist. "Something that can actually be verified." Walt said nothing. He had said nothing through the entire exchange. Claire had been speaking for him the way you speak for someone when you are trying to protect them, and she was doing it out of love, and it was completely the wrong read of the situation, but she did not know that yet. Calloway took a small step back. He had found his register, now the tone of a man who is being magnanimous about an inconvenience that is testing his patience. He spread his hand slightly, the gesture of reason reaching its limit. "Look," he said. His voice dropped to a register that was semi-private, but clearly intended for the nearby audience, the register of a man performing generosity. Every real service member, every warrior has a call sign, a name his unit gave him. The corner of his mouth lifted just fractionally. The smile of a man who is enjoying himself at someone else's expense while maintaining technical deniability. "What was yours?" "Let me guess, old-timer, the Professor Grandpa, maybe." He chuckled. The 2 junior Marines behind him shifted their weight with the discomfort of men who understand that what is happening is wrong, but have not yet found the mechanism to say so. The room was very still. Claire felt the heat of it rise in her chest, the anger, the helplessness, the particular fury of watching someone you love be diminished while you cannot stop it fast enough. She opened her mouth. Walt's hand came up. Not quickly, a slight, unhurried raise of 2 fingers at his side, a gesture so small and complete that it stopped her without a single word. She closed her mouth. He turned his head. For the first time in the entire exchange, Walter Harmon looked directly at Derek Calloway. His eyes, which had spent the last 10 minutes moving around the lobby with a kind of abstract patience, now found Calloway's face and stayed there. What was in them was not anger and not hurt. It was something else entirely, something old and settled and entirely without performance. The look of a man who has seen the full range of what human beings are capable of doing to each other in conditions that would reduce most people to their most basic responses, and who has arrived at a position about all of it that required neither display nor explanation. He spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet. Not weak, there is a difference, and every person in the room understood it immediately. It was rough in texture, shaped by decades of weather, and used the voice of a man who had given orders in the dark in places that did not appear on any map, and had been obeyed without question. "My call sign," Walter Harmon said, and the words fell into the silence of the Grand Meridian Hotel lobby, the way stones fall into still water, without hurry, without drama, and with an impact that moved outward from the center in every direction at once. "Was Iron Viper." Calloway heard the words, and something happened in his face that he could not prevent. It was not full recognition. It was the beginning of it, the first tremor of a structure that does not yet know it is about to fall. His eyes went to the patch, back to the face, back to the patch. The expression of a man who has just heard something that his mind is not yet willing to process, standing in a room full of people with no available path of retreat. In the shadows near the security desk, Gideon Kowalski had already turned away. His phone was in his hand, his thumb was moving. And Claire Harmon, standing in the middle of a hotel lobby in Washington on an October morning, stared at her grandfather's profile, the still white hair, the deep-cut face, the worn leather jacket with its faded patch, and felt for the first time in 24 years that she was standing in a story she did not know the shape of. She looked at the photograph still open on her phone. The patch, the two letters on the box. Iron Viper. She looked up at the old man. He was already looking past Calloway, past the desk, past the lobby, and the chandeliers, and the marble floor. His eyes focused on something that was not in this room at all, and never had been. Part 2. What the records don't say. The two words hung in the lobby the way certain sounds hang. After a bell has been struck, long past the moment of impact, still moving through everything they touched. Calloway had not moved. This was what Claire noticed first in the seconds after her grandfather spoke. The captain had not moved. He was still standing in the same position, 1 foot slightly forward, clipboard at his side, and the expression he had been wearing for the last 10 minutes was gone. What had replaced it was something rawer and less assembled. The look of a man who asked a question as a performance and received an answer that was not in the script. His eyes moved from Walt's face to the patch and back again, with the rapid, involuntary quality of a reflex rather than a choice. Around them, the lobby had shifted into a different kind of quiet. Not the anticipatory quiet of before, but a deeper one, the quiet of a room in which something has already happened, and the weight of it is only now being measured by the people present for it. The florist near the ballroom entrance had stopped entirely. The three officers near the far wall were no longer pretending inattention. Claire looked at Walt. He was still looking forward, past Calloway, past the lobby, at the particular middle distance that had nothing to do with this room. His hands were loose at his sides. His breathing was even. The leather jacket sat on his shoulders the way it always sat, as though it had been made for him, or he had been made for it, one gradually assuming the shape of the other over enough years that the distinction no longer mattered. She looked down at her phone. The photograph of the patch was still on the screen. She opened her browser with her thumb and typed Iron Viper military call sign. The results were immediate and useless. A video game character, a motorcycle club, a firearms accessories brand. She scrolled past them and tried a different angle. Project Viper Cold War Special Operations. Better. Marginal. 2 academic papers on Cold War doctrine that mentioned no such unit specifically. A Wikipedia article that was comprehensive about covert operations in general and specific about nothing she needed. A forum thread from a military history site. She clicked it, but the page had been taken down. Only the cached title was visible in the results. Project Viper. Anyone have information? Someone told me this unit. The cached text cut off. She navigated to a Veterans History Archive, a small independently maintained site she had used for background research before, the kind of site that collected first-person testimonies and unit histories from eras the official record preferred not to address directly. She worked through the subsections quickly. On the third page of a section titled Unverified and Classified Units Submitted Accounts, she found a single paragraph. No author, no date. I served adjacent to a unit that was never officially named in any documentation I saw. They were referred to informally as the Vipers. 5 men. They operated in forward areas that no other unit was cleared to enter. I never knew their real names. I saw the patch once on a jacket at a forward operating base I am not going to name here. After the operation in the fall of '72, They were not seen again. I asked about them once and was told there was nothing to ask about. Below the paragraph, set apart by a space, a single line that appeared to have been added later. 5 went in, 1 came out. Claire read it twice. She looked up from the phone. She looked at her grandfather, standing 4 feet away in his worn leather jacket, his eyes on a distance that had nothing to do with this hotel or this morning. She pressed refresh. The page reloaded. The paragraph was gone. The entire subsection had been replaced with a maintenance notice, content under review. She stood still for a long moment with the phone in her hand. She opened her notebook without looking down and wrote from memory, pressing harder than usual with the pen. She underlined it. Then she stood there with the pen still touching the paper and did not write anything else. Across the lobby near the administrative corridor, Gideon Kowalski had his back to the room. He stood close to the wall with the posture of a man who needs the conversation he is having to stay private. His personal phone was pressed to his ear. He had dialed the number from memory. It was a direct line to Colonel Patrick Drummond's office, a number given to him 2 years ago on the occasion of a prior security incident at this hotel, the kind of number provided for emergencies and not for routine use. The phone rang once. Drummond, clipped and efficient, a man midway through something who had not yet decided whether this interruption warranted full attention. Colonel, Kowalski Hotel Security. Sir, I need you to run a name right now. There's a situation in the main lobby. What kind of situation? Captain Calloway is detaining one of the general's personal guests, an elderly gentleman traveling with his granddaughter. Guest gave his name as Walter Harmon. Kowalski kept his voice flat and urgent, the tone of a man delivering critical information without the critical becoming audible in the wrong direction. Sir, I need you to cross-reference that name against the classified operational database. Cold War era. The designation is Project Viper. A short silence. When Drummond spoke again, his voice had changed register. The impatience had been replaced by something more careful. Say that again. At Walter Harmon, Project Viper. He's standing in the lobby right now, sir. Another silence. Give me 3 minutes, Drummond said. The line went dead. Kowalski lowered the phone and turned back toward the room. From here he could read the full shape of it, Calloway still positioned close to the old man, the crowd along the walls having grown by degrees, Claire standing with her notebook and her phone, and the expression of a young woman who has just found the edge of something she was not prepared to find. He could see Calloway's posture still upright, still performing authority, but with a fracture in it, now a subtle wrongness in the weight distribution, like a wall whose foundation has cracked without yet showing it on the surface. And he could see Walt. Walt had not moved an inch since speaking. He stood in the center of all of it, the room, the crowd, the captain's disrupted certainty with a stillness so complete it seemed to generate its own gravity. Kowalski had seen this quality before in certain men, and not many. He had seen it in the faces of the hardest instructors at Paris Island, the ones who had come from places the curriculum did not address. It was the stillness of someone for whom stillness had been at a specific point in their life a survival skill. A stillness so thoroughly learned that it had become the resting state. He had recognized it the moment Walter Harmon walked through the door. His phone buzzed. He turned to the wall. Kowalski, Drummond's voice. It was different now, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with what he had just read on a screen. I ran the name. A pause that stretched a beat too long. Kowalski, the file is flagged at the highest security clearance in this database. Most of it is redacted, but one field is visible. What does it say, sir? The silence this time lasted 3 full seconds. KIA, Drummond said. November 14th, 1972. Classified location. Another pause. The man standing in your lobby is listed in our system as having died 52 years ago. On paper, on any record accessible through standard channels, he does not exist. And the unit designation next to his name is Project Viper. Neither man spoke for a moment. I need you to call the general, Kowalski said. I know. The line went dead. On the 19th floor of the Grand Meridian, in a corner suite overlooking the dark geometry of Washington, Colonel Patrick Drummond stood at his desk with his hand still on the phone he had just set down. The laptop showed the database entry. He read it again. The long black lines of redaction, the single visible field, the status, KIA, and below it the designation Project Viper. He had heard the name once before in passing at a classified briefing on Cold War operational history he had attended as a junior officer. It had been mentioned briefly, the briefing officer using a category he called deniable assets units that operated outside the chain of command, outside the operational record, outside the institutional memory the military maintained about itself. The briefing officer had described them with a bureaucratic flatness that did not begin to account for what those men had actually been sent to do. Drummond picked up the desk phone and dialed the suite 2 floors above him. 3 rings. "What is it, Drummond?" The general's voice. The voice of a man in his mid-70s for whom every sentence came out already shaped like a decision. "Sir, I need you to come to the lobby." "I'm not dressed, sir." He paused for just a fraction of a second. "I ran a name. Walter Harmon. He's downstairs right now in the main lobby, and Captain Calloway is detaining him." The silence on the other end began the way previous silences had the pause of a man processing incoming information. But this one went longer, substantially longer, long enough that Drummond was about to speak when the general's voice returned, and it was not the same voice that had answered. "Say the name again." "Walter Harmon, sir." The silence resumed. In his suite, General Desmond Aldridge stood before the full-length mirror on the back of the bathroom door, his dress uniform jacket held in both hands mid-motion in the act of putting it on. He had stopped. The jacket hung from his hands without his awareness of it. He was 74 years old, and he had spent most of those years in the company of men who wore their service visibly ribbons and ranks in the accumulated iconography of a military life lived in the open on the record in the light. He had been one of those men himself. His chest was a cartography of conflict and commendation. But there was one story he had never told in full, not because it reflected poorly on him, not because it contained anything he was ashamed of, but because the men who had made it possible had never been given the ability to tell it themselves, and telling it without them had always seemed a form of theft he was not willing to commit. He set the jacket carefully down on the bed. He walked to the window and looked out over the city. He was 22 years old when it happened. Second Lieutenant Desmond Aldridge, 1 year out of Annapolis, assigned to a forward unit operating in a classified theater in the autumn of 1972. He had 200 men under his provisional command, not by rank but by the circumstance of their senior officer having been evacuated 2 days prior with a shrapnel wound. 200 men in a valley that had looked tactically sound on the map and had proven on the ground to be something else entirely. By the third night, they were fully encircled. Radio communications had degraded. Resupply was not coming. The perimeter was holding in the technical sense that the men walking it understood to be temporary. Aldridge had spent that third night moving from position to position in the dark, speaking quietly to his men, the way a young officer speaks when he is trying to project confidence he is not entirely sure he possesses. The attack came just before 4 in the morning, not from outside the perimeter, from the other side of the encircling force. From deep in the territory that was supposed to be wholly controlled by the enemy territory, that no unit under his command had any clearance to enter territory that did not appear on any map as anything other than hostile. It lasted 11 minutes. He had timed it afterward because the mind reaches for concrete measurement when it cannot otherwise process what it has experienced. 11 minutes of coordinated assault from an impossible angle, executed with a precision and controlled ferocity that broke the encirclement completely. In the noise in the dark and the sudden reversal of everything, Aldridge had not been able to see who was doing it. He had heard it, the disciplined fire, the movement, the communication in frequencies too low to carry the sounds of men who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it before. Then it was over. When the light came up, Aldridge walked the ground, all 200 men accounted for. The valley clear. On the wet earth near the tree line at the point where the assault had originated, he found a small piece of fabric. It had fallen or been left, he never knew which. A coiled serpent, a bolt of lightning. The embroidery hand made the thread already dark with moisture. He had picked it up and put it in his breast pocket, and when he tried afterward to ask about the unit that had broken them out, every answer he received was a variation on a single theme. There was no unit, there had been no operation. He wrote his account in the terms he was told to use, and the 11 minutes before dawn did not appear in any official document. He had kept the patch. He had carried it for 52 years, first in the breast pocket of a uniform jacket, then in a case in his study, and for the last several years in the inside pocket of whatever jacket he happened to be wearing. Not superstition, something else. The specific debt that a man carries when other men have paid a price on his behalf, and he has never been given a legitimate way to acknowledge it. He stood at the window and looked at the city and thought about the name Drummond had just said. Walter Harmon. He turned from the window. He picked up the jacket and put it on with the focused efficiency of a man who has decided what the next thing is and intends to do it without delay. He reached for the desk phone. "Drummond, get my security detail. Service elevator. 2 minutes." A pause. "And you tell Calloway not to touch that man. You tell him if he puts one hand on him in the wrong way, I will personally end his career before this evening is over. Are we clear?" He did not wait for the answer. In the lobby below, the situation had continued to develop with the particular momentum of confrontations that have passed the point of quiet resolution. Calloway had recovered something of his composure. Not all of it, but enough to reassemble the architecture of his authority, and the reassembly had taken the form of escalation. He was speaking again in the careful, measured register of a man using precision of language to do the work his confidence had briefly failed to accomplish. "Sir," he said, and the word itself was its own form of contempt in the way he placed it. "Sir, used not as respect but as a bracket around the absence of it. I understand you believe you were invited here. But until I can verify credentials you are claiming, I cannot allow you through to this event. And I have to say, with all due respect, that the name you just gave me corresponds to a classified file that is, as far as any official record shows, no longer attached to a living person." He paused on the last phrase. He let it land. "So you understand my position," he said. Walt said nothing. Claire did. "What exactly are you saying?" Her voice was controlled, but barely. "You're standing in front of my grandfather telling him that because the government buried his records, he doesn't exist." "I'm saying that in the absence of verifiable, he has an invitation from a 2-star general. What documentation does a man need to walk into a hotel lobby?" She stepped forward, not toward Calloway, but beside Walt so that she was standing shoulder to shoulder with him. It was a small movement and a complete one. "My grandfather has not raised his voice. He has not been rude. He has answered a question you had no right to ask in the tone you asked it. And you have spent 15 minutes using your rank to make him feel like he doesn't belong in a room that men like him built." She was aware that her voice was carrying further than she intended. She was aware of the observers along the walls, the growing audience, the 2 NCOs at the table who had abandoned all pretense of looking at their clipboards. She was aware of all of this and did not particularly care. Calloway's expression tightened with the calculation of a man assessing how far this has gone in front of how many witnesses. He turned back to Walt. And then he did the thing that Kowalski, watching from across the room, had spent the last several minutes hoping he would not do. He stepped close. Close enough that Walt would have had to take a step back to reestablish a normal distance, and Calloway was counting, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps not on the assumption that an 86-year-old man would take that step back. Walt did not move. Calloway extended one finger and tapped the patch on the sleeve of the leather jacket. A light tap, barely a contact. But deliberate, and the deliberateness was the entire point, the physical assertion of the right to touch, to handle, to treat the object and the man wearing it as things subject to his authority. "What is this thing really?" he said, his voice now in the semi-private register of a man who wants the nearby audience to hear him while appearing to speak only to the person in front of him. "A surplus store, a memorabilia shop." A short pause precisely timed. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a costume." The word landed in the room like a flat stone dropped into still water. Claire felt the impact physically, a constriction in her chest that was anger and grief in exactly equal parts. She looked at her grandfather's face. His expression had not changed, but something had changed behind it, something deep and quiet, a settling of some inner weight into a new position, the way certain old structures settle in cold weather. Not weakness, the opposite of weakness. The look of a man who has made his peace with the entire register of human behavior and is simply patiently waiting for this particular expression of it to finish. Across the lobby, slightly apart from the main body of observers, a man stood against the far wall. He was approximately her grandfather's height, heavy-set, 54 years old, with the kind of face that carries its decades fully and without resistance. He wore a good dark suit that had not been put on for this event. He had the look of someone who had come here for reasons that had nothing to do with the evening's program, a man who had made a calculation and acted on it, and was now standing very still watching a scene unfold that he had perhaps not expected to find when he arrived. He was not watching Calloway. He was not watching Claire. He was watching Walt. He was watching Walt the way you watch something you have been looking for a very long time. Claire noticed him. He became aware of her attention, and his eyes moved briefly to her face, and in the second before he adjusted his expression, she saw something in it that she recognized from her work, the particular rawness of a person who has lived for years with a question they have not been able to ask and is standing right now in the room where the answer might be. He moved, not toward the confrontation but toward the edge of it, toward Kowalski's position near the security desk. He stopped beside the older man and leaned slightly in his body language, the body language of someone who has made a decision and is executing it before the nerve fails. Claire was close enough to hear. "My name is Nolan Reeves," the man said quietly to Kowalski. "My father was Daniel Reeves. He was part of this unit. He didn't come home from the operation in '72, and the government told my mother he died in a training accident, and she never believed them. I have spent 30 years trying to find out what actually happened to him. A pause. This man is the only person still living who was there. Kowalski looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at Walt. Then he gave Nolan Reeves a single slow nod. Claire stood very still. She looked down at her phone at the photograph of the patch, at the words she had found on a page that no longer existed, at the 2 letters she had photographed on the lid of a small metal box in her grandfather's bedroom that morning. Iron Viper. She looked at the man standing 4 feet from her, 86 years old, standing in the middle of all of this, the lobby, the crowd, the captains, disrupted certainty with a stillness so complete it had its own gravity. A man who had come home from a place where the others had not and had said nothing about it to anyone, not for years, not for decades, not for more than half a century, who had carried something enormous in absolute silence and had continued each morning to set the coffee on and fold the napkins and make breakfast for anyone who happened to be staying in his house, because the habits of precision forged in the most extreme of circumstances do not leave a man, they only change what they are applied to. She looked at the 2 letters on her phone screen. She understood them now. She felt her eyes fill not from anger, not from the last 15 minutes of helplessness and heat, but from something older and quieter, from the recognition of what it is to carry something enormous without telling anyone, to walk through a world that does not know what you are holding, to be the most stable thing in someone's growing up years without that person ever asking or you ever saying what the stability was made of. She closed her notebook. She put the pen away. She stepped to his side and put her hand gently against his arm, not to comfort him because he did not need comfort, but because she needed to be connected to him in this particular moment, in the way that a granddaughter is connected to the person who was the most constant thing in her formation. She was only now beginning to understand what that constancy had cost. He did not look at her, but his hand came up and covered hers briefly, the old scarred weight of it, just for a second, and then returned to his side. Above them in the elevator shaft, a car had begun its descent from the upper floors. Outside the lobby's tall doors, footsteps were approaching with the measured, purposeful rhythm of men who are moving quickly without permitting themselves to appear to hurry, the specific gait of authority in motion, certain of its direction, quiet about its approach. Walt stood in the center of the Grand Meridian lobby and waited. He had been waiting. Claire understood now in the way that only certain people can wait, not passively, not with resignation, but with the settled, complete patience of a man who has already done what needed to be done and has been standing in the quiet ever since. Part 3. What is owed? The doors of the service elevator opened without fanfare. No announcement preceded it. No commotion. Just the soft mechanical sound of the doors parting and then footsteps on marble, measured, unhurried, carrying in their rhythm the weight of a man who had spent 5 decades walking into rooms and understanding without arrogance and without uncertainty that something changed when he entered them. General Desmond Aldridge walked out of the elevator corridor and into the lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel, and every person in that room felt it before they saw it. He was 74 years old, built along the lines of a man who had been lean and hard in his youth and had settled over the decades into something denser and more permanent. His dress uniform was immaculate in the way that only a uniform worn with complete indifference to appearance ever truly has not performed perfection, but the natural product of a discipline so thoroughly absorbed that it had become involuntary. His chest carried its ribbons the way an old wall carries its marks. Not decoration. Record. His face was the face of a man who had long since passed the age at which he needed to arrange his expression for any audience. Colonel Drummond flanked him on the left, his composure the composure of a man walking into a situation he has been briefed on but not fully prepared for. On the right, slightly behind, moved the sergeant major, a man whose face appeared to have been assembled from materials that did not include softness in any form. 4 Marines in their best uniforms followed with the quiet, fluid precision of men trained to be present without being noticed, until being noticed became necessary. Calloway saw them emerge from the corridor. He had a fraction of a second in which the information arrived before his face responded to it, and in that fraction, Claire, who had been watching him with the involuntary intensity of someone who has focused on a thing too long to stop, saw the exact moment the structure of his certainty gave way. Not a collapse, a crack running from the top down, swift and complete. His posture shifted, not dramatically, the kind of shift that most people in the room would not catch. But she had been watching his posture for 20 minutes. The general did not look at Calloway. He did not look at the crowd or the check-in table or the ornate ceiling. He walked across the marble floor with a directness so absolute that the lobby seemed to reorganize itself around it. The observers pulling fractionally back on each side, the space opening ahead of him, the entire architecture of the room rearranging its priorities. His eyes were on one person. He crossed the lobby and stopped 3 feet from Walter Harmon, and for a moment the two men simply looked at each other across the distance that decades in silence and unfinished accounting had placed between them. One old, one older. Both of them carrying the specific gravity of men who have been in places that do not appear on any map and have not spoken of it to anyone who was not also there. The general took a slow breath. He raised his hand to his brow in a salute so precise and so deliberate and so utterly without the performative quality that military salutes sometimes carry in ceremonial contexts that the room went completely silent. Not the anticipatory silence of before, the deeper silence of after, the silence of a thing that has already happened and whose weight is only now being fully felt. He held it. He held it the way you hold something you have been waiting a very long time to give. Walt looked at him. His eyes moved across the general's face with the same quiet, unhurried attention with which they moved across everything, taking in, without giving back anything that was not already there. Then he gave a single slow nod, the acknowledgement of a man who has spent enough time in extreme circumstances to understand that ceremony is a language for feelings that have no other form, and who has enough respect for the feeling to accept the language. Aldrich dropped the salute. He stood at ease, though ease was not the right word for the quality of energy coming off him. He turned, slowly, and for the first time since entering the lobby he looked at Captain Derek Calloway. Calloway stood 6 feet away. His face had completed the transformation that Claire had watched begin the moment the service elevator opened. The carefully constructed authority was gone entirely. What remained underneath it was something much younger and much less certain, the face she thought that had been underneath all along. A young man of 32 who had worn the architecture of command over it so thoroughly and for so long that he had perhaps forgotten it was architecture until this moment stripped it away. The general did not raise his voice. This was the thing those present would describe afterward, the thing that made the moment what it was. He spoke in a voice that was controlled and level and absolutely completely calm, the voice of a man for whom the full force of institutional authority has long since been internalized to the point where it requires no amplification to be felt in every corner of a large room. He spoke to the room first, not to Calloway, to the room. For those of you present, he said, and the acoustics of the lobby carried it without effort, I want to provide some context for what you have witnessed here this evening. He paused. He let the room settle around those words. During a period of this nation's history that we have chosen to remember imprecisely, there were operations conducted in the deepest forward areas of several classified theaters. These operations were not carried out by units that appeared in any official order of battle. They were not staffed by men whose service was recorded in any file accessible through standard channels. They were not acknowledged then. Most of them have not been acknowledged since. Another pause. His voice carried the quality of something being said for the last time after a very long silence. These men did not carry rank in any conventional sense. They were sent into places where no other unit could go to do what no other unit would do, with the full understanding that if they did not come back, the institution that sent them would not be in a position to say so. Their casualty rates approached 100%, not in the abstract. In fact, he turned slightly to encompass the full room. The unit I am describing was known to the small number of people with clearance to know it existed by a single word. Vipers. He let the word sit. 5 men. They operated in the fall of 1972 in a classified theater that I am not going to name here because the families of the men who died there deserve better than to have that location become a footnote in an after-dinner story. They executed multiple operations over a period of 6 weeks. On the last of those operations, they did not come home. He paused. All of them except one. The lobby was so quiet that Claire could hear the candles guttering in the ballroom off the main corridor. This man, Aldrich said, and he turned back to Walt, and his voice changed in a way that was subtle and complete, the voice of a general giving way to something more personal and more permanent. Did not simply serve in that unit. He built it. He selected its members. He led every operation it conducted. He brought them as far as it was possible to bring them, and when the last operation ended, the way it ended, he carried back what he could of the men he had brought there. He reached into the inside pocket of his dress uniform jacket. His hand came out holding something small, a piece of fabric aged and dark, the embroidery compressed by decades of proximity to the body. He held it flat on his palm and turned his hand so that the room could see it. A coiled serpent, a bolt of lightning, the same patch, smaller and darker than the one on Walt's sleeve, worn to a softness that spoke of 52 years of being carried close to the chest. But the same, unmistakably, completely the same. I have kept this, Aldrich said, since the morning of November 15, 1972, When I walked the ground of a valley I will not name and found it in the mud at the tree line. I kept it because the men who left it there could not be publicly honored, and keeping it was the only form of honor I had available to me. He set it carefully on the check-in table. This man received the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 silver stars, and a Navy Cross awarded in a ceremony with no press, no family, and no official record that any civilian archive can access. He received these decorations, and then he went home and resumed a life, because that is what men like this do. He has not spoken of any of it to anyone, not cleared to hear it, because that is also what men like this do. He turned to Calloway, fully, completely. "You," he said, and the word was quiet and absolute, "stood in a uniform that this man's service made possible. You used the authority of an institution that he served before you were born in order to humiliate him in a hotel lobby. You looked at a man whose record you cannot access, whose history was buried by the people who sent him, whose decorations were conferred in rooms you will never be invited to, and you decided that the absence of visible evidence was proof of the absence of substance." A pause. "You mistook his silence for confusion. You mistook his dignity for frailty. You used rank as a weapon against a civilian in front of witnesses, and you used it against a man who is worth more to this institution in 1 square inch of that worn leather jacket than you have demonstrated yourself to be in 8 years of service." He delivered the next sentence, one word at a time. "You will report to my office at 0600 tomorrow. You will surrender your command, and you and I will have a conversation about your future in this Corps that I promise will be the most consequential conversation of your professional life." Calloway did not speak. There was nothing to say. He stood in the wreckage of the last half hour and held very still, and Claire, watching him, had a complicated and unwanted feeling that she recognized from her work the specific stillness of someone who is hearing something that is going to change them and does not yet know what shape they will be when the change is done. The room exhaled. It was not a sound exactly. It was more a collective release of a breath the lobby had been holding for 20 minutes, and in the release, there was something she could not quite name, not triumph, not satisfaction, but the complicated grief-adjacent feeling of a reckoning that has been a long time in coming and has not in arriving made anything simple. Walt put his hand on the general's sleeve. The gesture was unhurried and without ceremony, 2 fingers resting lightly on pressed fabric, the hand of an old man reaching out with the ease of someone who has never needed to perform what he means. Aldridge turned. His expression, which had been hard and level through the entirety of his address, shifted immediately and completely, the shift of a face encountering something it has long since decided to always defer to. "Frank," Walt said. It was the first time he had used the name. The first time in the entire exchange that he had addressed anyone with anything approaching familiarity, and the room felt the intimacy of it, those 2 syllables falling between them as easily as if no decade had stood between the last time he had spoken them and this one. "Let the boy be," Walt said. Aldridge looked at him. "We were all young once." Walt's quiet voice moved through the room without competing for space in it. "We all believed we knew everything there was to know about what the uniform meant." His eyes moved briefly to Calloway, not with anger, not with contempt, but with the specific clear-eyed recognition of a man who has seen far worse versions of this particular human failure and has made a decision about how to hold it. "The uniform is heavy. Some men need time to learn how to carry it without letting it carry them instead." Aldrich held the old man's gaze for a long moment. Then he gave a single nod that contained in its brevity the beginning of something longer and more complicated than the public reckoning that had just concluded. Calloway looked at Walt. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Whatever he had prepared to say had not survived contact with the reality of this moment, and he was perhaps for the first time in a long time wise enough to recognize that. Then Nolan Reeves stepped out of the crowd. He had been standing against the far wall in the position he had occupied since his conversation with Kowalski. He was a large man with a deliberate way of moving and a face that carried the full weight of its decades without resistance. He walked across the lobby floor with the careful, measured pace of a man who has made a decision and is simply executing it, and he stopped 6 feet from Walt and said nothing. He looked at the old man. Walt looked back. The lobby watched. There was a quality to the silence between them that was different from everything that had preceded it. Their earlier silences had been charged with confrontation with authority meeting its limits. This silence was different. It was the silence of 2 people standing on either side of a very long story, each holding one end of it finally in the same room. Aldridge looked at the man who had stepped forward. His eyes moved across the face with the careful attention of a man who reads people rather than performs readings of them. "Who are you?" he said, not unfriendly, direct. "Nolan Reeves," the man said. His voice was steady. "Daniel Reeves was my father." The general went very still. He looked at Walt. Walt was looking at Nolan with an expression Claire had never seen on his face before. Not surprise, something beyond surprise. Something that had already processed the surprise and arrived at a place on the other side of it. The expression of a man who has been holding a thing for a very long time and has just encountered the person the thing belongs to and is accounting in real time for what the next 60 seconds will require of him. "You're Danny's boy," Walt said. It was not a question. Nolan nodded. His jaw was tight. He was 54 years old, and he had spent decades assembling and maintaining a composure specifically for the purpose of not coming apart at the moment he most needed to hold himself together, and he was using all of it now. "I was 2 years old," he said, "when he didn't come home." Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he reached up and began to undo the buttons of the leather jacket. Not the outer buttons, the inner ones. The lining buttons, the ones that secured an interior pocket that Claire had never known existed in all the years she had watched him wear that jacket. He worked them slowly, his large scarred hands managing the small buttons with a patience that had nothing to do with the limitations of age and everything to do with the weight of what he was doing. He reached into the interior of the jacket. He brought out the metal box. The same box that had fallen from the closet shelf that morning. The same brushed aluminum, the same dark patina of age, the same 2 letters engraved on the lid. He held it flat in both hands the way you hold something that is not yours to drop, and he looked at it for a moment with an expression that was entirely private and entirely complete, and then he looked up. The room watched him open it. There was a small latch on one side, a slight depression in the metal, that when pressed with the thumb released the lid with a quiet, precise sound. Walt pressed it. The lid opened. Inside the box were 4 sets of dog tags, military identification tags, aluminum source, each on its original chain, each stamped with the information of the person who had worn it. They had been arranged inside the box with a deliberateness that spoke of the care with which they had been placed there and the regularity with which they had been regarded. Each set nested beside the next with the exactness of something that has been touched often by hands that always know precisely where everything is. They had been there for 52 years. The lobby looked at 4 small pieces of stamped metal in an aluminum box in the hands of an 86-year-old man and understood without needing it, explained exactly what it was looking at. Walt lifted 1 set of tags from the box with 2 fingers. He held it for a moment, his eyes on it, his expression, the expression of a man saying something silently that he has been saying silently for half a century. Then he extended his hand toward Nolan Reeves. The tag caught the light as it swung on its chain. "Reeves Daniel J." Nolan looked at it. He looked at it for a long time without moving. Claire watched his face do the complicated involuntary work of a man encountering the concrete reality of an absence that has been abstract for his entire conscious life. His father had been a name, a photograph, a specific quality of silence in his mother's expression whenever certain subjects came near. He had been a missing answer at the end of 30 years of searching. He had been the reason Nolan had taught himself to navigate military archives and file freedom of information requests and sit in the offices of veterans organizations and ask the same question in the same patient tone until whoever sat across from him either told him something useful or asked him to leave. His father had never been something you could hold in your hand. Until now, Nolan reached out and took the tags. His fingers closed around them with a careful, complete pressure, and then he stood there with them in his fist and his eyes very bright, and the composure he had spent decades building held but only in the technical sense that he remained standing. Everything else about the way he held himself in that moment was the opposite of composed. Walt looked at him. "Your father made that patch," he said, the quiet voice moving through the room without effort. "The night before the last operation. He stayed up with a needle and thread, and he made it by hand because he said if we were going to be the Vipers, we might as well look like it." He paused. He was 19 years old. He was from Bozeman, Montana. He wanted to be a rancher when he got home. Another pause, the kind that carries something in it. "He was the best man I ever had the privilege of leading, and I have thought about him every day since November of 1972. Nolan did not speak. He could not speak. He stood in the lobby of the Grand Meridian with his father's wax in his fist, and he looked at the old man in the leather jacket, and he nodded once slowly with the quality of a gesture that is trying to carry 30 years of searching in a single movement and not quite managing it and not minding that it cannot. Claire turned away from the scene, not because she could not bear to look, because she understood clearly and without ambiguity that she should not be looking. There are moments that belong only to the people inside them, and the professional impulse to observe and record and eventually render into language is sometimes the precise wrong response. And this was that kind of moment. She looked down at her notebook, at the page where she had written the words she had found on a page that no longer existed. 5 went in, One came out. She looked at her pen for a long moment. Then she put it away. She closed the notebook and held it against her chest and stood beside her grandfather, while the room around them became, in the space of a few minutes, something different from what it had been when they walked through the door. The ball that evening was everything a Marine Corps birthday ball was designed to be. The Grand Meridian Ballroom filled with the ordered splendor of dress uniforms and evening gowns. Long tables set with precision candles throwing warm light across the faces of people who had gathered to mark the continuation of something they had each in their own way, and to their own degree, given portions of their lives to serve. General Aldridge escorted Walt from the lobby to the ballroom, personally walking beside him with the unhurried attentiveness of a man who has waited 52 years to be in the same room with the person who saved his life and intends to use whatever portion of this evening is available to him well. They were given the table at the front. At one point in the formal program, the sergeant major leaned into the microphone and mentioned in the spare factual language of military ceremony that the evening's honored guest was Walter Harmon, who had served in a classified capacity during the Cold War era, and whose decorations, the sergeant major said, with the careful understatement of someone who knows exactly what he is underplaying, were considerable. The room rose. Walt remained seated. He looked at the standing room with his steady eyes, and he did not appear particularly moved by the gesture, in the way a man waiting for acknowledgement is moved when it finally arrives. He appeared, if anything, slightly impatient for the room to sit down so that the evening could continue. Claire beside him saw this and felt something release in her chest that she had not known was held. When the sergeant major invited Walt to speak, Walt shook his head. He said to Aldridge quietly, not for the microphone, "I'll say one thing about Danny." Aldridge nodded and leaned toward the microphone. "Mr. Harmon would like to share something." Walt did not stand. He spoke from where he was sitting in his worn leather jacket at the front table of a ballroom full of dress uniforms and accumulated ceremony, and his voice carried without effort. "The night before our last operation," he said, "one of my men stayed up late with a needle and a spool of thread. He was 19 years old. He had a picture in his head of what the patch should look like, and he wasn't willing to let anyone else make it. He was particular about things. His name was Danny Reeves. He was from Bozeman, Montana. He had a wife and a son he had not yet met, and he intended to get home to both of them." Walt stopped for a moment. "I want you to know that name. Danny Reeves. He was not in any official record. He did not receive a public ceremony. His family was told he died in a training accident. He deserved better than that, and I am sorry it has taken this long for anyone to say so in a room of this size." The room was completely silent. Walt picked up his water glass, drank from it, and set it down. "That's all," he said. The room held the silence for one full second, and then it responded in the way rooms respond to the truth when it is delivered without ornament, not with noise, but with the collective settling stillness of people who have just heard something they will carry with them. In the back of the ballroom, Nolan Reeves sat at a small table near the wall. Kowalski had arranged a place setting there quietly and, without discussion, the way a man who understands that certain things need to be done handles the doing of them without making the need into a conversation. Nolan sat with his father's dog tags on the table in front of him, in the space where a place card might have been, and he listened to the old man say his father's name in a room full of Marines, and he held his face very still, and he let the tears run without wiping them. Claire sat at the front table beside her grandfather and watched the candle on the table in front of them and thought about the morning. The closet, the box falling, the 2 letters in the metal lid. The way he had taken it back from her hand, without explanation, without apology, without any acknowledgement that an explanation might reasonably be expected. She had been faintly irritated by it, she realized now. The journalist in her had filed it as a withheld detail, something to pursue. She understood now that it had not been withholding. It had been protection. Not of himself, of her, of the ordinary life he had spent 86 years maintaining around the perimeter of what he actually was. The coffee every morning, the eggs sunny side up, the folded napkins placed with the precision of someone who had learned in the most extreme of circumstances that care for small things was its own form of keeping the world together. He had applied that precision every day of his life, quietly, without credit, without complaint, keeping the people he loved at a safe and comfortable distance from what he had seen, because that was also a form of service, and he had understood it as such. She looked at his profile beside her, the deep-lined face, the still white hair, the jacket that had outlasted everything the world had tried to do to the man wearing. She thought, "I have been sitting next to a story my entire life, and I never once looked directly at it." She thought, "I am glad I did not write it down." She reached over and put her hand on his arm the same way she had in the lobby. He did not look at her. He was watching the room, watching Nolan at the back table, watching the faces of the Marines along the long tables, watching with the expression of a man taking a quiet inventory of something he has waited a long time to see and is satisfied with. His hand came up and covered hers for a moment, the old scarred weight of it brief and complete, and then returned to his side. That was enough. 3 weeks later. The Founders Diner on King Street in Alexandria was the kind of place that had been in the same location for 40 years without deciding to be anything other than what it was. Vinyl seats the color of old burgundy, a counter with stools that had stopped rotating sometime in the 90s, coffee in thick white mugs refilled without being asked, a smell of butter and griddle smoke so thoroughly worked into the walls that it had become indistinguishable from the structure. Walt and Claire came here most Saturday mornings. The corner booth, the dark coffee, the eggs the same, the comfortable silence of two people who have learned that presence is its own language. She was reading. He was watching the street through the window with the mild, unhurried expression of a man who has seen enough streets in enough conditions that no individual one holds much power over him. Before they had left the house that morning, she had checked her phone. There was a message from Nolan Reeves. She had given him her number at the ball, the journalist's instinct moving faster than the personal one, and she had almost regretted it afterward, had worried it felt like a professional encroachment on something that was not a professional moment. But the message was not a request for an interview. It read, "My mother is 79. She still lives in Bozeman. She never stopped believing he died doing something that mattered, even when the government gave her a story that didn't hold together. I called her the night of the ball, and I told her what I know now. I told her his name is going to be on the memorial the Corps is building for classified unit veterans. She asked me who told me. I said an old man who carried his tags home for 52 years and never once put them down. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, tell him thank you, so thank you." Claire had read it twice and set the phone on the kitchen table and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the wall, breathing carefully. She had not told Walt. She did not think she would. Some messages are not for the person they are ultimately about. Some messages exist only for the person who needed to send them and for the person who needed to receive them, and the accounting between those two is already complete. She was still sitting with this thought when the bell above the diner door sounded at 9:40. She looked up. Derek Calloway walked in, civilian clothes. I stared at him. Clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, nothing that identified him as anything. He looked smaller than he had in the lobby, not physically, but in the way that certain people look smaller when the thing that has been doing the work of their presence is no longer being worn. He stood inside the entrance for a moment, scanning the room, and when he found the corner booth, his face did a complicated and brief thing, and then settled into something quieter and less defended than she had seen it do before. He walked to their booth. He stopped at the edge of the table with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the salt shaker, then at the table surface, then slowly at Walt. He was carrying something under one arm, a bound document, the kind that has been handled many times and shows it in the softening of the cover and the slight curve of the spine. He took it out. He set it on the table. It was a thesis, 30 pages spiral bound, produced for a graduate-level submission. The cover sheet was visible. Shadow Units and Deniable Assets, Operational History of Cold War, Special Forces, 1965 to 1975. Below the title, the author's name. Below that, in a professor's red ink, excellent analysis. Unit designations, unverifiable mark as historical conjecture. Below the professor's note in different handwriting, newer, sharper, written with a pen, pressed harder into the paper, 3 words. I was wrong. Walt looked at the cover page. He read the title. He read the professor's note. He read the 3 words added in a different hand, and his expression moved through the quiet, unhurried process of a man who is choosing to understand something fully before he responds to it. Then for the second time since Claire had known him to do it, the corner of his mouth moved. He looked up at Calloway. He looked at him with the full, clear attention he gave to everything, and in that attention there was no residue of the lobby, no echo of the humiliation or the crowd or the general's address or any of the rest of it. There was only a man looking at another man and seeing what was actually there. Not the rank, not the performance, not the failure. The person underneath all of it, young, uncertain, carrying the particular weight of someone who has just understood for the first time the true dimensions of what he does not yet know. Walt gestured with his chin at the empty seat across from him. Sit down, son, he said. His voice was exactly what it always was. Quiet, rough, unhurried. The coffee is good here. Calloway sat. Claire looked at the two of them across the table from each other. The old man in the leather jacket, the young officer in civilian clothes. The thesis with its 3 added words between them. The morning light coming through the diner window, at the angle it came at this time of year in Alexandria, landing on the worn vinyl. The thick white mugs, the two faces, one deeply lined and one not yet, both turned toward the other, with the attention of people who have arrived at a conversation that is going to matter. The waitress appeared and refilled their coffee without being asked the way she always did. Claire looked down at her notebook. She had opened it when they sat down the way she always did. The journalist's reflex toward the record, toward the capture of the moment, toward the transformation of living experience into language that can be handed to another person. The habit was so deep in her, it operated before she was aware of making a choice about it. She looked at the open page, at the pen in her hand. She thought about a page on a veteran's archive that had appeared and disappeared in the time it took to press refresh. She thought about a classified database entry that said KIA next to the name of a man sitting 3 feet away, drinking his coffee. She thought about 4 sets of dog tags in an aluminum box. She thought about a 19-year-old from Bozeman, Montana, staying up late with a needle and thread because he had a picture in his head and wasn't willing to let anyone else make it. She thought about a woman in Bozeman who was 79 years old and had never stopped believing that her husband's death had mattered, and who had finally heard it confirmed last night from her son, third-hand and imperfect and completely true. She thought about what it means to be the one who carries the story, not the one who writes it, the one who carries it, the one who takes it into every room they walk into and sets the table around it every morning and folds the napkins just so and makes the coffee dark and strong and never once asks for acknowledgement of the weight, because the weight is not a burden, it is a form of keeping faith. She understood this now. She understood it in the way you understand something that has been true your entire life once you have finally looked at it directly. She put the pen away. She closed the notebook. Outside on King Street, the October world went about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that in a corner booth in a diner that had occupied the same building for 40 years, Walter Harmon was telling a young man what it had cost to become Iron Viper. Not the operations, not the classified geography of a theater that still had no public name, not the tactical details that would stay sealed for another generation, but the human cost, the weight of it, the shape of it, what it does to a man to lead other men into darkness and be the only one to walk back out, and what it means to decide in the long years after to keep walking, to set the table, to fold the napkins, to make the coffee dark and strong every morning for whoever happens to be staying in your house, because that is also a form of service, and you have never once confused the form with the substance. Calloway listened. He listened the way people listen when they understand they are being given something they have not earned and have decided to spend whatever comes after being worthy of the gift. Claire sat beside her grandfather in the corner booth of the Founder's Diner and did not write a single word. She already knew how the story ended. Not because it was finished, it was not finished, it would not be finished for as long as Walt was alive to carry it, and perhaps not even then. Because Nolan Reeves was carrying it now too, and Calloway was beginning to, and she supposed that she was as well, in whatever form it would take in the life she was still in the early stages of building. Stories like this do not end. They are passed from hand to hand in the dark, way a man passes the tags of his fallen to the son who grew up without them, and the son holds them and understands for the first time that his father was real in ways that photographs and silences had never been able to make real before. The morning light moved on the table. Outside the window, the street went on, and on the left sleeve of the leather jacket, barely visible in the shifting October light, a coiled serpent, a bolt of lightning hand-stitched by a 19-year-old boy, the night before he went somewhere he did not come back from, caught a moment of sun. Still there, after everything. Still there.